Punishment must fit the crime. The only punishment warranted in this case is death.
Britain, unlike the United States, no longer imposes the death penalty. But our jails now house over 50,000 prisoners, and many of them return to prison time and again. Are they just plain bad? Or can biology explain their behavior?
One could argue that they are victims of their brain dysfunction and don't have the same control that a normal person does.
There has to be something wrong, or else I wouldn't have wasted half my life in prison.
New discoveries in the exploration of the brain raise questions about the very nature of guilt and punishment.
We assume in the law that everybody is born with enough sense to control their own behavior. On the other hand, we should realize that there are some people who are so impaired or so different in the way they control their own behavior that to hold them criminally responsible would be as though we were holding a 3-year-old child responsible. The question is, where is the line to be drawn? And the biological state of an individual's brain is the really critical determiner.
An American lawyer recently ran a genetic defense in an unsuccessful effort to save his client from the death penalty.
What we were suggesting was that a genetic defect may have had a role in his aberrant conduct and may have in fact diminished his ability to exercise free will.
If we were to diagnose some career criminals as suffering from a disorder, doesn't this give a carte blanche towards excusing such behavior? No, absolutely not. Even though they may be suffering from a disorder, we still need to institutionalize them. We need to protect society.
Joe Whitty, people like the Moors murderers, people like the boys who killed Jamie Bulger, the only word that most people can think of for those people is evil. Do you think that's an adequate explanation, or do you think what we have heard from these programs helps us understand a little bit more?
No, I think it's a dreadful expression, especially when it's applied to children as young as 9, 10, 11 years of age who kill. The truth of the matter is that we don't know what, in fact, is happening to children who commit offences of this sort. And this is one of the reasons why I am attracted, as almost a diagnostic tool, the type of research that is being done. We actually start off in institutions, and for very young children it's obviously in secure units, and we have a degree, or we have a form of treatment which really is based on, with respect to Brina, which is based on, at times I think, total nonsense in terms of our approach in psychotherapeutic terms. And I think that certainly is as could be as criticised as what the biological process is. I don't think that it denies the responsibility, and one of the interesting things I find is the guilt that many of these people will actually talk about when they're in the institution. And I have many anecdotes of people who did not understand why they committed the type of offences that they did. I've actually had sex offender, one man in particular who stays with me, who pleaded with me not to let him out because he knew that he would commit a very serious crime, a very violent crime. And I literally had to push him out of the door. Within a matter of months, he was back in, having committed a very serious offence. But from my point of view, as the custodian, his sentence was finished. Nobody else knew what to do with him. In fact, I would suggest that nobody else within our system even looked at what to do with him.
So would you cling to this evidence sort of almost in desperation?
No, I don't think it's desperation. It's another tool. It's another diagnostic tool in a field where, at the moment, be it with boys like the Bulger case or adult serious offenders, there are no diagnostic tools at the moment within our society.
Stephen, do you have any idea?
I'm not sure what you would do with a diagnostic tool, even were it actually valid. I mean, one of the problems is precisely the problem that Michael raised in the last discussion in relationship to Brina. Predict that a child age 4 is 80% likely to grow up to be a violent criminal, which is, I think, the figure that Adrian Rain uses somewhere earlier on. And you're automatically changing the entire context in which that child develops. There becomes the danger of all those things that we know about self-fulfilling prophecies and so on. I want to be clear. I'm absolutely convinced, I couldn't work as as a brain scientist if there wasn't, that there is a clear-cut relationship between how our brains are and what we do. But what we're seeing here is a set of very primitive statements being made about very complex systems about which one knows really rather little and in which research is only just beginning. I've no doubt that there are special cases of children who have who commit the murders, like the Bulger case and so on. But it's also the case that arguments about violence are as well socially constructed.
Can I just bring Adrian in at this point? I mean, you've heard throughout, you know, the accusation. This is marginal stuff. These are huge declaratory statements made by you, which don't really have any basis in the evidence, which must be quite tough for a scientist to hear. Are you saying crime is a disorder like schizophrenia, like epilepsy?
I would suggest personally, my own personal view is that recidivistic, repeated violent offending may in and of itself constitute a disorder, just as in the same way depression or schizophrenia does. I think that there's a strong social and biological basis to this behavior, which is set early in life. And one of the tragedies is that people become imprisoned by their early behavior processes. We know that the kids who are going to become the child molesters, the child murderers, the rapists in the future, the seeds are set early on in the first 8 years of life through both negative social and biological predispositions.
So do notions of guilt apply then?
For some of those children, no, because some of those children cannot experience guilt.
But what are we going to do about the fact that ultimately every aspect of what we do, how we behave, is actually sort of going to be related to activities of our brain cells firing, neurotransmitters and so on? I suggest that in fact the more we know about the neurosciences and whether we accept your evidence or not, the more the old legal distinctions between mad and bad are really going to find themselves in very considerable difficulty.
Well, let's ask the lawyer how he's going to deal with it.
Firstly, as far as children are concerned, the age of criminal responsibility is 10 in this country, so as a matter of public policy, that's where one draws the line. I think one of the really interesting matters that came out of the programs and does trigger disturbing thoughts is if you are able to identify at an early age a
disorder, a deficit?
yes, a disorder or a propensity to commit disorder is the next step, and I think it might be a very slippery slope to suggest then that the state must step in and take certain measures. For instance, the professor on the shot we saw said, well, as I understood him, reducing it to a simple statement, that no, there's no responsibility, but you go on to institutionalise. Now, that, I think, is a very difficult area indeed of how you categorise responsibility.
Do you think the law will be able to cope with a plea of not guilty on account of neurotransmitters?
Well, remember that as far as the law of murder is concerned in this country, we recognise abnormality of mind, whether it's arrested or retarded development or disease of the mind. But that if it substantially impairs responsibility, the result is that it only reduces, and I say only advisedly, murder to manslaughter, so that the state holds the person responsible for manslaughter. So the abnormality of mind does not excuse the responsibility.
Mike, I mean, do you think that all this is perhaps playing into the hands of people who say, oh, you're being soft on the criminals, you're giving them an excuse to hold on to?
Well, Professor Rain's view of the situation does raise profound questions, because it does go to what lawyers call mens rea, the intention. In order to convict someone and lock them away, you really need some degree of intention. You know, there are a few exceptions to that, but basically that's what we're looking at. And if you say that that degree of intention is not there because of a disorder, then what are you suggesting we do with these people like Bobby Joe Long, who had committed a whole series of rapes, and yet a number of the professors on the programme there were all suggesting that these criminals, like Bobby Joe Long, were really victims, poor things. Well, what we've really got to do is make sure that the public is protected from these people. Now, you do say we need to institutionalise them to treat them, but what are you suggesting, that if Bobby Joe Long, with all his problems, ought to be sent to some hospital somewhere, given some treatment, and then released back into the community? What are you suggesting? How do we deal with that sort of case?
Right, it's a very good question. I think we have to deal with it at two levels. First of all, I think the efforts have to be placed on interventions with children and adolescents, kids at an early age who are beginning to show the type of predispositions in terms of behaviour that Bobby Joe Long would have shown. It's very difficult, indeed, as you know, to change adult criminal 35-year-old offenders. We need to get to individuals much earlier in life.
But what do we do about Bobby J. Long? We lock him away so that he's not going to hurt anyone for the rest of his life
do we
when he's
get
ill?
to them, though? That's, I think, the important question.
To answer your question, what I would suggest that we do with him is that if we can demonstrate he does have clearly many social and biological predispositions to violence, which did restrict the range of his free will in taking the actions that he did,
does, and Dr.
then
Karadzic
what
does
we
as
should
well.
do, therefore, is not punish him as harshly as we are doing, that we should not execute him and take him his life.
Isn't there a need for punishment?
But it is of no consequence to people who, if they are suffering from the disorder that is claimed, it is of no consequence to apply punishment. In that particular case, you're applying punishment as a deterrent to the rest of the population.
Or as protection.
But yeah, well, certainly in the state of our knowledge and our complete lack of treatment techniques throughout the world, let alone in this country, Bobby J. Long would have to be incarcerated for the remainder of his life. Yes. Full stop. But having said that, I think if I could pick up the point that was made about what do you do, perhaps one of the things that it would do is indicate to us what we shouldn't do. I mean, perhaps these people should not be in a general prison population where I and my staff, for example, have to meet them every day without any access to protection, without any access to drug treatment, etc., etc., etc. Because once a person comes into the prison system, then we are left with what we've got. And believe me, he will receive no treatment. If there is a basis of biological nature, he will receive no treatment. If he's doing 25, 35, 40 life years, then fair enough, we will keep him and he will never be released.
Stephen Rose is desperate.
My great concern is that he is eventually released. And if there is a biological basis, then as a member of the public, let alone as a member of the prison service, I want to be quite sure that this man, the possibility of him committing offences is very much reduced.
I'm all happy with that, but the predictive nature is what worries me, because I would guess that if you actually looked at brain scans of politicians or generals, you would find as a significantly high proportion of them having exactly the same, quotes, low frontal activity that Adrian Raine is talking about. And what needs to be understood is why has crime, violent crime, increased so dramatically in this country, and especially in the United States, where homicides have gone up, I think, something like 50% in the 10 years from 86 and 95.
Adrian, can you answer that? Because presumably our neurotransmitter levels have stayed the same.
It's not biochemical, it's not serotonin.
It's social reasons.
Well, I think what we have seen a dramatic rise, sure, since the 1960s to the 1990s in America and England, a massive increase in crime. We've also seen a massive increase in illegal drug use. And drugs do affect the brain.
But that's a different argument from your argument about predispositions because of brain damage.
No, I don't think so, because if you have a pregnant mother taking cocaine, that infant is going to have dysfunction and damage to its brain in turn. And there has been an increase in the rates of mothers. In one study, in one city in America, if you take the urine of the newborn babies of these mothers, 7% you can find cocaine in the urine of the newborn baby.
And that's going to have some effect.
That's going to have some brain effect.
Well, I don't have to deal with these matters quite in the same way. I think about children as they're brought in by troubled parents who say, I'm scared about my child. I'm scared about what he's doing. I'm scared about how he treats his brother or his sister. So here's a parent who's concerned and who brings the worry to me, which is a little different than my going out and saying, your child will do such and such, which is a prediction one cannot really make. But when you look at these children and look at them as they behave in school, for example, one boy who repeatedly threw rocks until he seriously damaged another child's eye. And he was punished by the school. The punishments don't, by the way, work. And he was punished by his parent. And finally, when this child was confronted by mother and school and father and a community of people with his behavior, he looked and he said, I know I shouldn't do it. I cannot help myself. I cannot help myself. Stop me. This boy was 5 years old.
I mean, Stephen, if you had a child in that predicament, wouldn't you, as a parent, go to Brina and say, look, I'm prepared to take a risk on this biology being right?
I would be desperate. I don't wish to say anything about my own children here in this particular context, but actually it seems to me that children who do, in fact, have some of the behaviours that Brina is talking about, like stealing, like a degree of violence and so on, grow up to be all sorts of things, from lawyers onwards, upwards and downwards. And the problem is the predictive capacity. And clearly the sorts of psychotherapy treatments that Brina uses, which include cognitive and behavioural therapies and so on, are ones which are an eclectic mix. We've got to try something. That's absolutely, that goes without saying.
Therein lies the danger of labelling people with this predisposition, which raises very real concerns. Is the child of 4 or 5 to be put on a path which is to lead to institutions and control?
That child only comes to the fore because it's already presenting this type of behaviour at a very early age.
Yes, but
the vast majority of psychopaths, and I take the point, you know, I have met psychopaths in business, I've certainly met psychopaths in Parliament, and I've certainly met psychopaths who have got
nobody really knows what is a psychopath. Right. No, it seems to me we all could fall at some point of our lives within it.
It's a very dangerous time.
But it is just a predisposition, as I understand it, which, depending on the social and the nurturing effect, may lead them to very serious offences. But I certainly would not go along with the idea that, you know, because a person has this particular type of brain disorder, he by definition is going to be A, B or C. Because one of the great problems I would have there is why it is that the vast majority, I'd be prepared to say almost 99% of these people who I have met in prison, and that's where most of them are, those who are in behaviour disorders, are in fact from the poor, from the lower social classes, and who come from the inner city and the other areas. And this is where then my belief in the environmental pressures on people, which turns the vast majority of them into crime, is where I then start to take a different tack.
Can I pick up the issue about the psychopath? Because the psychopath is someone for whom we feel no remorse at all, and we find him unforgivable, we find him evil because he shows no remorse. The programmes and the evidence suggest at the moment that he is incapable of showing remorse, and indeed that is why he is a psychopath. He is not capable of educating himself in rational behaviour. So isn't the psychopath the person for whom we should perhaps give more clemency, as it were?
I think that the definition of a psychopath is a very problematic one. I think Alan Levy is exactly right about that. It's a word which is tossed around, but I think one's got to be very careful about it. And I come back to the question I half-asked before. Are General Mladic and Dr. Karadzic psychopaths because of their involvement in ethnic cleansing, in mass rape in Bosnia and so on? The most incredible degree of violence that we've seen in recent years in Europe.
But I think you mustn't confuse lack of control or lack of ability to control oneself with lack of remorse. I mean, some people probably come within the category who may well have no remorse, but are perfectly able to control themselves, but don't control themselves because they enjoy what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Let's leave it there for the moment. The new evidence has been described as dangerous, and if there's a scientific basis to crime, doesn't that give the people in white coats the power over us? Or does diagnosing one cause of crime give us the hope of a cure? Join us after the break.